is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. Since 2008, we've been bringing you audiological ingredients, the podcast, for you to brew your own faith, bringing you voices from the academy, be they theologians, philosophers, scientists, and all sorts of things in between. And today on the podcast, you're going to get to hear from a theological ethics professor at Trinity College, Dublin, Dr. Jacob Erickson. That's right. He's on the podcast. We're going to talk about a Theopoetics of the earth. He's going to talk about the way his Lutheran upbringing, its theology of the cross connected him to process thought. He's going to talk about a gospel without eternal conscious torment. What is the nature of grief in the ecological crisis? Oh, yeah. The practical relativism of climate denial. That's going to come up. We're going to give some shout outs to some pastoral care, to Marjorie Suchocki, talk about youth ministry and climate anxiety, and a whole host of other exciting things. So you don't want to miss it. And here's the thing. We recorded this episode after we had spent most of the day hanging out. He came to the University of Edinburgh to give a paper in the Theology and Ethics research seminar. It was spectacular. Then we decided to go get some lunch. Now, he's not from Edinburgh. I was very, very new. I had been with students a couple times to Brew Dog, which is a brewery, but they have a very nice restaurant, and they have like the best cauliflower buffalo wings I've ever had in my life. They're super delicious, okay? And I'm like, Jacob, you got to go try out cauliflower buffalo wings. Oh, this is great. Let's go. We're walking. We get lost because I didn't know what I was doing. Then we go to the wrong Brew Dog, not the one with cauliflower buffalo wings. Then we walk to the real Brew Dog that has said cauliflower buffalo wings, have ourselves a great time, get back to my office, we record this podcast. So this podcast comes after spending hours being lost, enjoying cauliflower buffalo wings, a few beverages at Brew Dog, and it sounds like friends hanging out, discussing all sorts of things, because that's what it had turned into. So this is a special episode. It's not trying to, figure out how you relate across a screen being mediated, but joining two nerdy friends talking. And and here's also, he's a member of the Keller Collective. That means he was a Catherine Keller student. And they're some of my favorite people. All right. Now, before we jump in, I want to remind everyone that in June, we're starting The Rise of Bonhoeffer, Ethics and Empire in a Post-Truth Era, the online pop-up learning community for the month of June at Homebrewed Christianity is The Rise of Bonhoeffer. We're going to be reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer and then looking at him in his own historical context and in ours today. That's right, the man who wrote Cost of Discipleship, Powerful Ethics, Letters and Papers from Prison. We're going to be reading them, trying to understand them in his historical context, his life, his movement from nonviolent pacifist to participating in the conspiracy to try to assassinate Hitler. And then we're going to look at those texts in our own context with the rise of white supremacy today in light of the ecological crisis, under all the quarantine that's going on connected to COVID and all this kinds of stuff. We're going to try to do that. And here's why. Eric Metaxas kind of ruined Bonhoeffer. There's a guy, if you don't know him, he likes Donald Trump and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So you have to admit that's some serious creative interpretation of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Nonetheless, he made Bonhoeffer, put him back on the map for a lot of people. And then they think, oh, so if you read Bonhoeffer, you must be down for Donald Trump. No. So we're going to dig into Dietrich's text, look at him in his context, then bring him to ours. We're going to have ourselves a good old nerdy time. But who's helping me, you say? Oh, what would happen if my friend of the pod, author of the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to the End, but also he wrote a book called Religionless Christianity, Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Troubled Times. What if the good Dr. Jeffrey C. Pugh, theological ethicist extraordinaire, joined me? Then it would basically be like theological Christmas getting that news. And that's what it is. It's theological Christmas. Because Jeffrey C. Pugh's joining for this class. So go to riseofbonhoeffer.com or you could go to bonhoeffer.rocks. Yeah, .rocks is an ending of web addresses. And so I bought Bonhoeffer.rocks. So you can go there as well to sign up for the reading group. It is pay what you can. So those of you that are having difficult financial situations in light of everything that's going on, sign up, enjoy, find community, read some good stuff. Those of you that have the ability to donate and give, that would be super duper excellent because, given everything that's gone on, I've had quite a few members lose their jobs, and obviously they don't need to be donating to the homebrew community in that situation. And I've lost quite a few speaking gigs. So I would definitely love whatever support you can give. But most importantly, I think in this time of crisis and this time of kind of forced pause for a large part of the world and the economy, reading someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer becomes really, really powerful and helpful. So, yeah, go to riseofbonhoeffer.com, join up, and enjoy the fun. Now, before we jump into the episode, we have a sponsor this week. Here is our sponsor, and then you'll hear Jacob.
There are hard questions that go through our minds all the time. And Google will deliver a variety of sites that can give you answers to some of those questions. In some situations, some of the time. But a tool that we've had for centuries, long before the internet was invented, is the Word of God. But usually when we think of the Bible, we also think old, outdated, irrelevant. Many of us relate to the Bible sometimes. But what if there was a Bible for all times? This is why Tyndale created the Life Application Study Bible. It's for people who are alive. Woo! The best-selling study Bible in the entire world. The pure text of the Bible, paired with 10,000 plus notes written in plain English. Profiles, maps, timelines, Smythe sewn binding so it lays flat. Really flat. Full size, personal size, leather, black letter, red letter. Now you have no excuse not to understand the Bible. You're welcome. The new Life Application Study Bible for all times.
All right, homebrewed Christianity listeners, this is Tripp, and today on the podcast is Jacob Erickson, who is a Theology and Ethics professor at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. But sorry to disappoint you, aren't going to get an Irish accent.
No, not quite.
Not quite. So Jacob's been here at New College in Edinburgh, and he gave a paper today. On top of that, he is from Drew, which is like the second coolest PhD program in the United States after going to the very source of process theology.
Yeah. Agreed. I mean, yeah.
So maybe the place to start is you're a Lutheran. You grew up in North Dakota. Yeah. So how in the world do you get into process theology, queer theology, eco-theology, and your home church has 20 Lutherans in the middle of nowhere?
Yeah, Sarin Lutheran, God's peace on the prairie. Is
that their like branding exercise?
That's their branding exercise, but it's a branding exercise that's for the handful of people that actually know it already. So it's a sort of identity symbol connection, perhaps. I don't know. Yeah.
Like, what's their total like? The area itself, you said, isn't even that big. Like, what's the total population around?
Well, the closest town from where I grew up, and I grew up on this family farm,
right.
Multiple generations, and the closest town is Minot, which is at the time when I was growing up, probably, 40,000. But with the oil boom in western North Dakota, the Bakken, it's sort of swelled to 60, 70, and I don't even actually know directly right now. So it's a very different place from when I was growing up there. But it's a if you can imagine sort of a flat horizon line, your quintessential prairie. The first time I took friends home, they asked me where my neighbors were, and we were outside, and I pointed, and I was like there, and it was a house 5 or 6 miles away, and you could see the neighbors in the yard. It's that sort of plain, ordinary prairie culture, and something that I deeply love.
When I moved to Los Angeles for PhD program, and people would ask questions just because they're like, "You're a Southerner," so that's interesting.
Yeah,
and the second half of growing up, I was in Raleigh, which is a capital city and stuff. The first half was very rural North Carolina and Arkansas.
Yeah.
And so they're like, so like what was different? I said, well, I had 4 neighbors, but they were all tobacco fields.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And mine were, it's this one particular coyote, a few cows, and then my family and our 7 dogs at the time. So
yeah,
it's a riotous collective of things and creatures.
And so I'm interested in how, as someone who now, like in Dublin, you said it's basically like 8 blocks of intense city and everything gets packed into that. When you talk to people who didn't have an experience, especially when they're young enough that they're kind of the emotional resonance of living in the world is being formed. When they didn't have an experience of animals being as close as people, or trees being as much fun to play in as structures that someone built, or that type of thing. How do you describe it? Because I've always had that. That's been a problem for me, even though I'm talking in California sometimes with someone who's like, I'm an ethical vegan. I love the planet, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, yeah, but have you ever gone like fishing and gone under your favorite tree? And like the way they even imagine life for someone in that is foreign. Yeah. And I really feel like that's like one of the challenges of our contemporary context is communicating when people's embodied relationship to nature is so diverse.
Yeah. Yeah. The diversity of experience is so interesting to me. And experientially, as I've lived in cities since sort of leaving the farm, I had a professor and teacher when I was an undergraduate who said, he asked me where I was from. I said, I came from this farm in North Dakota. And he's like, oh, you're the last of those, to come, these students who, were coming off of an agricultural context into thinking about religion or theology, maybe into seminary, maybe into whatever. And so much of it is, urban, experience and formation now, which is also, in my mind, ecological. And I think a lot of what my, disposition in those spaces is of cultivating certain kinds of attentiveness to how any built environment, how any city environment, how any local environment is itself already an ecological environment already. So whereas I grew up with a ton of animals, now I have these occasional starlings that nest on my porch, and the river and archipelago of the sort of Irish Sea and the aquatic and oceanic cultures are a different kind of noticing. Mm-hmm. The familiarity for me is when I explain the prairie to folks in Ireland, I'm like, it's basically looking out at the ocean. It's the same kind of horizon line. It's a distance. It's a kind of plainness, but there's that kind of tohomic depth to it as well. Just as there is under the ocean, there is under the prairie with the grassroots structures and complex ecosystems and things like that. So then they glaze their eyes and they're like, what are you talking about? And then we start over again. So
well, yeah, and I think part of that is part of the challenge in facing the ecological crisis and then challenging the ideologies that so many of us, especially in an urban context, are born into without the experiences to challenge its finality, right? Like when you're looking at the traditions, the institutions and such that form us without those experiences to call back to. Right. So where as a theologian and ethicist do you begin a conversation, for, I don't know what the best way to put it, like the thoroughly urbanized who don't have the existential connection to a nature not determined by human will and consumption?
That's a really interesting way of framing it. Because I would say at the outset too, that my experience growing up where I did, had deep human impact as well, right? I grew up in an agricultural context where, plowed land and, histories of settler colonialism are just as built up kinds of memories as are the agricultural products that are cities. And it's asking, how are those different kinds of ecological formations?
Yeah.
So part of it's thinking history, part of it's thinking about the ways that what we normally perceive to be what is ecology in our minds, these archetypes of mountains and trees and untouched wilderness. Actually, cities are a perfect place, and urban contexts are a perfect place to start, I think, because when you say that they're ecologies themselves, it actually is a more honest kind of rendering than these sort of projected deities of untouched wilderness that have had really dangerous actual histories and histories of colonialism, right? These ideas that that North America is this sort of untouched Garden of Eden to be conquered and tilled and plowed, that levels entire nations of peoples that already exist. And so I want to be pretty careful there that I don't think the rural-urban binary is as strong as people think it is. And the question is then, what do those places have in common, given our histories and what people call the Anthropocene, what people call living after nature, and how do we live differently in them?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things behind it in asking the question that way is when I was a minister in a very rural context to an urban one, like if you just polled on, do you care about these ecological issues? Yeah. Right. The urban mainline Protestants are going to raise their hand very quickly. Right? Sure. Like they're like, we support science. Yeah. And all that kind of stuff. In a rural context, they would have been much more hesitant. In the rural context, if I just listened to the congregants' explanations of how the natural world around them that they are attentive to is changing, then there are very specific local issues you can latch onto. So, the congregation rural context, we ended up adopting the water reservoir for the whole area, which then got incorporated in our liturgy and prayers and all sorts of things that like, if they just told you what we did, you'd be like, wow, you scored a lot of progressive process points. Yeah. But if you were in the congregation, they're just observing their attentiveness or attention to nature because of both their vocation and their hobbies and loving the woods they've always grown up in and all that kind of thing. It involves a type of knowing that you don't have as often in an urban context, right? So those places of context meant there were opportunities as a minister hoping to raise awareness that when I was in Los Angeles, I didn't have. Yeah. Like I was facilitated the first time some of the students were in a place where they saw no other human other than the 10 or 15 they're with. Yeah, right. Like they had never done that. Yeah. And I'm like, I did it every weekend when I went fishing. It was like me and my dogs. you know, and like the idea that there was no cell phone and no one had a problem with it. And, there wasn't another person. You don't need him. Maybe my brother came. Like that was totally okay. Yeah. Yeah. Because you had a very different relationship to kind of the, I don't know, unmarked part of creation, like going into a national forest. It's also contrasting. This is something that I've recently been thinking about just in listening when I mentioned to some fellow staff members about like wanting to go hiking with my son this summer. And I'm like asking where to go. They're making suggestions. I'm like, yeah, so it's like a certain time you have to worry about bears. Right. And they're like, no, Trip. Yeah. This, like when we
megafauna, Scotland,
they're like that's not a live option on this island,
right.
Like there's you're gonna walk across anything that puts you in their food chain, right? And if you've ever had one of those experiences, it dramatically changes the way you see the world. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it really, to imagine yourself in a food chain is a very different kind of place. And I mean, that's one that even I don't fully know, but I always think back to, was Val Plumwood's reflections on being prey when she was attacked by the crocodile, and the sort of paradigm shifting experience that actually is to imagine yourself in something else's ecological habitat is mind-blowing. I mean, we experience it with weather, maybe, and these large weather events. It's not, there are certain kinds of beasts, maybe not animated, animal, plant beasts, but weather beasts, and things that put us kind of in our fragile humus of humanity, sort of God speaking to Job out of the whirlwind sort of moments, but, it's a different world, I think.
Well, your larger project, and you talked a little bit about it today, is developing a Theopoetics of the earth. So when you, why pick the word earth as opposed to nature, world, creation? And what does it being a Theopoetics versus a theology of, do you mean? What's contained in picking that type of definition to a project?
Yeah. Let's see. Let me start a little bit back, sort of your original question at the beginning one of the places where I entered theology was a really strange moment of recognition. I'm 17. I'm taking my first religion class in undergraduate. In my undergraduate program, or one of the first two, and the professor decides to assign to us volume 2 of Paul Tillich's Systematic Theology. And some of the clips of the rest of the Systematic. And I'm a prairie kid. Ground and these big horizon lines are always in my mind. The expansiveness of the sky is always in my mind. It's the closest thing that I can imagine to a reality of spiritual presence or divinity. Is this kind of holy space in my imagination that holds my community, my peoples, my creatures, my relations, and the phrase ground of being for divinity popped in to that language there. And I was like, oh, that's the first time that any sort of reflection of how to understand this word that we use, God, what that is and what that does, the power of being, the ground of being with, or energy of being, or something like that. But the ground language was really powerful to me because it was present, it was earthly, it was animating everything that I already knew. And throughout study, I sort of became enamored with, process theology and Theopoetics, and went to study with Catherine Keller, and so the two words, Theopoetics and earth. I'll start with earth. Earth, for me, is somewhat of a catch-all term that is inclusive of planetary life in a very broad way. I think, the totality of all organic and non-organic creatures, the mineralic, the animal, vegetable, mineral, the atmospheric compositions that shape the earth, and that sense of gravity for it. I mean, it could have also been a Theopoetics of this oceanic planet, because it has that kind of that sort of surface area as well. There's something about planetarity that's interesting to me, that I want to begin to think not just on local ecological scales, just me and my experience of nature or this place that I love, but in a context of climate change, in the wake of global warming, when we find ourselves within the problem, and that all of our questions are conditioned by that very problem. We can't get outside of it as if it were an object. Timothy Martin's called it a hyperobject. That's a whole different discourse. But I'm interested in thinking, what does it mean to talk theologically about the materiality and life of where we are in a totality? And at the same time, I'm not interested in doing that in a solely logical way, because it seems to me that histories of logocentrism, of logos thinking, so instrumentalize our thinking and our feeling and our doing, and have so often instrumentalized forms of colonial extraction of the planet itself. I'm interested in thinking, what does it mean to talk about divinity in this context of Earth in a big way? What does it mean to not just talk about divinity, but actually make divinity on the planet in such a way that its art, its creativity transforms the way we live in the present? I'm a big poetry fan. I think that poetry itself is able to hold a lot of the contradictions of our moments, but I do mean theopoetics in the deep sense of making. That there's something of a poiesis, something of a making that theology needs to be doing to provide for resilient strategies in our current age. And I also do mean divine self-making. I've been really convinced by a 9th century Irish mystic, John Scotus Eriugena, which I sort of wrote a lot about before I moved to Ireland and even knew I was coming here. That for him, every single creature, every single created thing is a form of divine self-creation. It's about a divine making, and every creature and every existent thing is a kind of theophany of divinity. And that self-creativity is so profound. I thoroughly believe in a very immanent kind of divine, and think about, or try to think about, what does it mean to talk about a sort of plain prairie divine immanence that is also at the same time planetary. I don't know if that.
It's actually really helpful, and like immediately kind of what pops in my head from the way you put it is it Earth in a sense is the name too, right? Yeah. Like so if you think of how so much of the trajectory of dominance over the planet comes from a kind of perverse picture of human power and responsibility that comes in the through the biblical text of us naming things, and then we end up after the Enlightenment thinking only humans have the spirit part or the soul part or whatever. That then to say it's a theopoetics of Earth, like immediately means like if the theopoetics is going to include humans, you're going to have to include everything else. Yeah. And it's everything else on this one planet that has names, and everything else on it we've named. And if you want to be at home in the poiesis of God, then like you're going to have to acknowledge your neighbors. Yeah. But and I think that's such here's been my experience since moving here. So you can just provide your wisdom since you've, been over the pond for 3 years now. Whatever makes when you say that seem obviously clear and resonate with me does not immediately compute to a larger percentage of people than ones I encountered in Los Angeles. And I don't really know what to make of that. Right? Like that if you're going to talk about anthropology, then the idea that it's somehow cut off from the doctrine of creation in a distinct way just seems problematic, right? Like if you're going to just talk in normal, theological categories. But even under that is maybe the philosophical privileging of human enactment in the world versus any other. Like those things just seem so utterly problematic, and those philosophical issues that are connected to it. One of the things I loved about what you said you were working on your larger project is we have to rethink through creation. We have to rethink through pneumatology, because the very philosophical terms, whether they're acknowledged or not, that the church has thought through in the last couple hundred years while global capitalism and nation states pillage the poor on the planet, are ones that gave us this privilege where you didn't even question the consequences, right? Until what? Privileged people in the West start feeling, rising waters and extra, it's not until we have a heart attack, essentially, that you thought maybe you shouldn't have waffles for breakfast every day.
Yeah.
Right? I feel like that's where we're at.
Yeah.
And so, when you start talking about the theopoetics of the earth, where are the places, as someone who goes, this demands me rethink through traditional doctrines again? Where do you go? What do you cleave to? And maybe say a little bit about it as a Lutheran theologian, because we haven't even mentioned that. Since you all are jumping into the last 4 hours or so of Jacob and I talking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the question of what it means to engage in processes of relearning our planetarity, to reconstruct theological doctrines, or even just think about constructing theological ideas, and forms of spirituality that might help us navigate the current moment. That's a really difficult one. On one hand, I'll start with maybe your latter Lutheran instigation. I really think, and you've had folks like Douglas John Hall on the podcast before, that the theology of the cross for me is really an important way of framing how I know the world. That it was really I got to process theology and critiques of divine omnipotence through a Lutheran theology of the cross. That if I'm going to talk about a kind of Christology that talks about the death of God, or at least that if the cross says anything about theology to me as a Lutheran theologian, what it says to me is that here is God saying, I am not a sovereign at the end of the day. And what that means in large goes into larger metaphysical questions and all. But so in some cases I came through this through very orthodox ways, maybe not necessarily in a kind of atonement way, but the theology of a cross as, what Mary Solberg has called a kind of epistemology of the cross, or the compelling knowledge where a kind of imaginary of the cross, a cruciform imaginary epistemology of the cross beckons one to see and honestly name suffering where it is. And not just name suffering and see suffering and be attentive to it, but engage in forms of transformation for the sake of changing that context. Everything from, in my mind, Luther's Heidelberg Disputation to Dorothy Zilla's suffering, to Moltmann's Crucified God, to these sort of crucifixations of thought are really important to me. On the other hand, I'm really interested in moving away from theology that focuses on doctrines of creation via traditional notions of God the Father or God through Jesus as some sort of cosmic Christ. They seem to me to be places of, for me at least, kinds of patriarchal toxicity. And the pneumatology piece is so interesting to me, and there's so much amazing work being done in rethinking what a kind of creator spirit does, how it vivifies life, how does it engage with the materiality of our world, the panoply of pneumatological metaphor, from sort of divine bunny rabbits to the flopping around dove in the background to there's this animation of language that's so powerful to me. Because when I talk about divinity, the easiest way for me to talk about it is through these minute gestures of ecological life. Like that's where I find the most profound kind of cataphatic language for this apophatic spirit that is both enlivening the world, but also in enlivening the world is also deeply affected by it. That's the matrix of where I want to be.
You know what that makes me think of is Roger Haidt, the Catholic theologian. His critique of how Logos Christologies function through church history is he's like, you get the New Testament and, there's at least 13 New Testament Christologies, which, I mean, I get. I'm just going to take his word for it because I've read the New Testament enough to know there's more than one.
Right.
But he goes, then the church liked this one. Yeah. And they went through a period of hypostatization. Right? Like, so that the whole Christological controversies lead to, because of demands of questions, needing to have solutions, and all of a sudden you get this hypostatic union, and then the solution gets staticized, or whatever he invents the word. And then you then return to a text that has all these different poetic trajectories from it. The New Testament includes 4 different gospels with their very different accounts of what it means for Jesus to be the Christ and what the consequences are and what discipleship looks like. And then Paul changes his mind repeatedly, depending on which ones you think he wrote. And then there are things older than that. He's like, the New Testament has all these different ways of talking about what was getting itself done in Christ. And then all of a sudden the church is like, nope. Here's our Trinitarian interpretation of the prologue of John, and I hope you all agree. Right? And so to me, one of the tasks in even thinking back through all theology, I think there are those places where you have this, if you're thinking process, a form of misplaced concreteness, right? That you're wanting to preserve the reality of the affirmation that God was in Christ and is present in the body of Christ today. And then in order to do that, you start to defending a hill. Yeah. And all of a sudden, all these other places that were full of life, you're neglecting, and you're building up walls. And then it gets to a point, there's not even a fight over these things anymore. And you've, siloed yourself. Yeah. Right. And so both the New Testament itself is giving all these different images of the Spirit. There's like Spirit Christology was much more popular than Logos Christology in the early church. Yeah. But now, if you want to do Spirit Christology, unless you're edgy, it has to cohere with the Logos one. And I think that's the same type of thing takes place in doctrines of creation. Yeah. Right? Like, well, what does it mean to be in creation? Yeah. Well, you're a part of nature. Well, what's nature? And you start to ask all these questions, and it leads to privileging the modern subject. Yeah. And how do you know that? Because everybody's version of what salvation looks like is going to a modern subject. Yeah. And what happened the whole time all these people were getting saved? More people got saved in the last 50 years of church history than all the years before it. Yeah, exactly. And in the last 50 years, we tripled the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and don't know if our great-grandkids get to breathe correctly. Yeah, yeah. But like that.
Yeah, salvation is not carbon neutral.
No.
Like it's just not. No. It's not a. No,
there's a high quality hot air joke to be used there.
It drives me wild because it's almost as if you are going to go for an orthodox form of a doctrinal setup, if you're going to think about the loci communes of classical theology, it's almost as if someone planted a garden and all the boxes are different doctrines, and they said, "Oh yeah, let's just plant and water this one Jesus one and neglect everything else." It's like you're walking into a dead garden of doctrinal creativity. Yeah. And you can talk about reimagining those spaces all you want, but unless there's serious and hopeful constructive work being done, thinking about the planet in all of those spaces and in none of them, then there's no hope for meaningful theology to be done, I think. It's mind-boggling to me why, it's not mind-boggling for me, in the sense that, why people are attracted to certain kinds of doctrinal life. They're attracted to certain doctrines because those doctrines are often very quintessentially anthropocentric, very human. God the Father, Jesus Christ as this paradigmatic human, the church and salvation as representations of forms of modern individuality and modern privilege and modern sovereign control of choice. But there are all these gritty spots that are persistently frustrating, whether it be the internal inconsistencies in the Gospels and the beauty of recovering of various forms of historical imaginaries for Jesus or the church or whatever. That really one needs to sort of pull back as a reusable history for the present moment, but also recognize that climate change presents new forms of issues. In some ways, I don't think by turning to a different kind of pneumatology or turning to a different kind of constructive theology, that I'm completely abandoning Christology, and I wouldn't want to do that either. And in fact, I think I'm actually being very authentically faithful to this Jesus who is very fluent in Hebrew nature poetry for thinking about God. I mean, that's a very real, lived kind of theology for me, and I think it's happening all over.
Jesus definitely uses a lot of it, the type of imagery, and that's why I really feel like we have to update all of his parables,
Yeah.
to the video game references and things like that. There is a sense that to read the parables of Jesus, like on top of inviting you to think through what the kingdom of God might look like if it subverts and upturns all of our values, it also asks you to imagine living in a world where you are that close to the way in which the rest of God's creation provided life for you and your family and your friends and your neighbors, right? Like, and even your enemies, because, well, Sermon on the Mount makes it clear, so I do think there's a sense that the way the economy and late capitalism has, for efficiency's sake, alienated us from so many parts of the rest of creation and relationships, and then put us in this reproductive capacity, where we're functioning a lot of times like cogs in systems that we're so alienated from the fullness of life people in other generations had. When we go to talk about the good news, right? Like, you don't encounter people that walk around going, man, I'm a sinner, and I hope I don't have eternal conscious torment. Like, the idea of eternal conscious torment is just so bad. And I hope that the revival preacher revs me up and I walk the aisle. Like, that's not an anxiety we have. But if you pay attention, there are a lot of us that don't even know if we'll ever get to be human. Right? And I think part of what a Theopoetics of the earth is trying to do is to say that even in an age of ecological crisis, in a culture where the rhythms of life, consumption, and creation are so determined by things that don't acknowledge our inherent value, worth, and the relationships we have. Like, the gospel has to be, if it's going to say good news, it has to speak to this place, not one that's waiting to sit on the anxious bench at the Great Awakening, but the one we're in.
Yeah. Some Lutheran theologians phrase, the idea of sort of this eternal conscious torment, piece that's common in, certain forms of evangelical Christianity and elsewhere, is actually somewhat of a foreign, experience or concept for me, of sort of the Lutheran understanding of grace was so pervasive in my experience and formation as someone attempting to be Christian and also attempting to be a theologian at any given time. But living into that and thinking about our current moment means, I think, attempting to be very subversive and what I've said elsewhere in some of my queer eco-theological work, irreverent, even in where we find theology, in how we make it, in what kind of concepts we imagine for God. A lot of that, I mean, of course, is pioneered here with Marcella Althaus-Reid in Indecent Theology. But this idea that I really want to challenge, on one hand, our current form of complacency towards addressing environmental issues. And on the other hand, when I say irreverence and subversion, what I mean is really trying not to be reverent to these old static forms of omnipotent God, that a God who creates and instrumentalizes the planet and uses it for certain soteriological purposes, absence human beings and the rest of it burns. And that image replicates itself in the ways that humans imagine the Imago Dei. There are other complicated ways that it does that. I want to be deeply irreverent towards that conception of God. I also want to be deeply irreverent towards a concept of nature and creation that is static and singular and unchanging and always focused on flourishing or living, because perpetual perishing, things die. And that's actually something that is priestly creation narrative good. Yeah. like God doesn't create the world and says there's no death, although, tree of life and tree of knowledge of good and evil and all that. But this ongoing sense of deconstructing creation as if it were something that's like, here's a game board. This is what it's going to be. This is what it's always going to be. Just move the pieces around a little bit. That's not going to work for me either. And that means that we actually, this is the dangerous part of it, I think, for us as folks who are trying to figure out our way, and folks that are in various privileges, grieving what it meant to be a modern individual, or recognizing that project from our perspectives was always a problem to begin with. It means that we actually have to participate in creation. Yeah. Like that we actually have to listen to our creaturely kin, that we actually have to engage in processes of creativity, of care, of thinking, of making hard decisions about what lives and dies sometimes. And if anything, the recent fires in Australia and the endangerment of certain species there, and thinking about, okay, what does management of this ecological disaster mean? And that question of management, asking what lives and dies, what do we grieve? What do we let go? What do we carry on? How do we carry on differently is going to be a question that a lot of us are going to be asking more and more and more. Mm-hmm.
So today you use Lynn White's kind of famous article, this kind of early in the ecological critique of religion, as a exemplar of a type of misplaced concreteness that goes on in ecological ramblings, right? Like where if you can tell the origin story of something, which people of privilege usually want to do so they can then locate themselves in the redemption narrative. Yeah. But like, now, a lot of what he's pointing out, I think, is really helpful, but also you gave this beautiful paper that's saying, if you're dealing primarily with the way ideas, narratives, and stories lead to our current predicament, then you're actually missing out on the very parts of the human that can connect with nature, like, and you're thinking of affect and grief and these type of things. So can you kind of unpack that to, especially maybe say a bit about White's article for those that have never read it, which if you haven't, then shame on you.
Yeah.
In a non-shame based understanding of relationships. You should go check it out. But then I just found that really helpful and spent half a page thinking of questions I wanted to ask you about it.
Yeah, sure.
And like you kind of passed over it so quickly because you covered so much in your paper that I think that's really worth helping people that are wrestling with grief around ecological crisis, and especially ministers who are ministering to people experiencing grief around the ecological crisis.
Yeah. So I have a colleague who is has to teach Lynn White's article every term, and she says that she's sort of sick of it because it's so important and pivotal for the emergence of the fields of religion and ecology and eco-theology. But so it's a 1967 piece, Lynn White Jr., historian, the historical roots of our ecologic crisis. And this is really important that a lot of folks will mistype it. Actually, one of the great games of eco-theology is going through everybody's major books and seeing which ones of them have misspelled this title because they want to spell ecological crisis. Uh-huh. And that's important because what White is trying to do is he's trying to locate the kind of intellectual historical origins of a certain kind of pattern of thinking, of ecologic, that brings us, at least for him in 1967 in this article in Science, what patterns of ecologic allow for that form of contemporary environmental destruction. 67, he's talking about all of that stuff in the emergence of a global environmental awareness. And he says that a certain form of Latinate Christianity that focuses on dominion, that focuses on human salvation, human individuals, is a deep problem. And he says that Christianity, in his mind, at that moment, is the most anthropocentric, human-centered, self-centered religion the world has ever seen. He doesn't simply say that it's that logic. He says it's actually, being a good medieval historian, he says, okay, actually, where's the origin of it? Surprise, it's in medieval history, where this pattern of thinking links up with the emergence of great agricultural technologies, and that power to actually reshape the planet is made available to folks. That's the first half of the thesis. The second half of the thesis is often forgotten too, and I think it's actually a really beautiful piece that actually the remedy for that kind of thinking is a reimagined kind of religious remedy. It requires some sort of theological or eco-spiritual thinking. White finds that in folks like Francis or in Eastern forms of Christianity that have a different kind of creation theology and otherwise. But what I was doing in my paper today is I'm saying that one of the habits of modern colonialism, and I'm thinking a lot with Catherine Youssef, who's this brilliant geographer. She's working with critical Black studies, questions of the Anthropocene, amazing book that everyone needs to read, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None. And she says that kind of origin thinking, that trying to find the origin to this problem as if it's like, here I found where it begins. I can root it out and I can fix it. I have control over it. I have sovereign control over it, and I can fundamentally change it so it's all better. That pattern that's found in White, that's found in a lot of the ways that academics operate. If I only get this concept right that critiques the problem and offers a fix, I can make a career off of that. She says
there's a lot of dissertations with the phrase genealogy in it that don't have to do with DNA. Right. Exactly. Is this desire for origins, which process theology is so critiqued already,
is just a replication of the patterns and habits of thinking of colonial logics of extraction that have got us into this problem in the first place. And I think rather than thinking about grand origins, or grand forms of beginnings and sovereignty like that, have a little bit more of face of the deep to homophilia to it, and think, okay, how does human emotion, affect, experience break through those kinds of logics? And if you begin there, what kind of habits and patterns do you see? Folks dealing with ecological grief, people in denial, people trying to save the planet, in quotes, people trying to recreate communities, people afraid for their future. That I think those places are places of disruption that might help us contemplate what it means to live differently. I pointed this out earlier today as well, that the water protectors in Standing Rock were responding not just to the fact that the pipeline was to go on sacred land with very complicated histories of cheating and treaties with the United States government, but it was also a response to a mother who was worried that this pipeline was going over the sacred burial site of her child. And those moments of that moment of grief in particular, and the calls that were put out, started a certain kind of ecological movement that's carrying in-flesh possibility to this day. And caused a lot of folks to think differently about what does it mean to have to rely on such a skeletal structure of fossil fuel infrastructure. So I think the creaturely dimension of grief, I wouldn't say just human, but the creaturely dimension of grief, the creaturely dimension of feeling, planetary feeling is what I'm calling it, is a better place to start than trying to do that grand critique.
In one of the things that came to mind to me when you were talking about white, and then you gave a number of examples after it that do similar things, is recently I've been reading this new book by Michael Kerr, who's a Bowen family systems theorist, and it's a rather large, dense book, kind of recapitulating the theory in a contemporary context. And in it, he talks about the problem of the identified patient, that so often, people, when they encounter tension and anxiety and then toxic patterns, right? Like, you want a solution. And part of getting to a solution, if you don't want to grow, change, heal, be honest about the issue, is to find somebody to be the fall person. So like if you and I, have like serious issues, but we're going to blame this person over here who's, working with us and is a complete loser, doesn't do anything, blah, 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 blah. We all get together. We're like, yep, there's the problem. We're like, they may have some issues and they haven't been trained on something and they need to work on it or whatever. But if you deal with that side issue, you aren't actually acknowledging the fact that the real problem in the room is that the actual web of relations is toxic.
Yes.
That the relationships themselves all are nodes in a system that's a problem.
Yeah.
And if you want to try to have temporary relief of the anxiety, then get a majority in the room to agree something is the problem. Because if it becomes a thing and it gets identified and you're like, there's the problem, there's the patient, there's the issue. Once it turns to substance-based thinking, you aren't going to move towards wholeness. You're going to move towards a remedy of a solution, right? And then it's going to show back up. Yeah. And I think that for people of privilege, almost anyone that will listen to this podcast, you're someone who already knows that the decisions you have made and are making will have consequences to thousands of people you'll never see and may never be. And so then you hear the data on the ecological crisis.
Yeah.
And then you look at your daily habits and you're like, if I just had a story that I could uproot and blame someone that likes Rush Limbaugh or whatever the thing is, right?
Yeah.
Like if I can find the problem and then exorcise them from my life or shame people that don't do what I do, all that kind of stuff all of a sudden enables you to feel like you're part of a solution, because what you really, really are attached to is the privilege that comes in the assumptions of your way of being in the world, and they haven't been questioned.
Yeah.
Right. And that same kind of thing comes up in a lot of kind of contemporary Marxist critiques of identity politics. And there are all these different ways these types of observations come. But I found like the way you were critiquing it so helpful, because the question of grief then is not, you're basically saying you would rather live in grief than be honest. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, I mean, you didn't put it that directly, but that's not my existential experience of it was going like, Trip, here's the thing. A lot of the people you deal with as a minister are people who love their chains. They'll call them jewelry before they admit they have a problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they don't know what it's like to live life not shackled to these habits, to these privilege, to this situation.
Yeah. And it's so hard to disrupt. It's so hard to disrupt dysfunctional family systems that have sedimented over time, that have, or even patterns of ecological behavior that have sedimented over time, and to gain the amount of social capital, expression to think about how we change that or change patterns is really difficult for a lot of folks, because there's a lot of books you'll notice when they are dealing with climate change or environmental devastation begin with what I call the litanies. They're like, these are all the extinctions that are happening. This is the planet is unlivable in the future, and this is what you're going to have to deal with. Our food systems are shot. Fresh water is going to be unavailable. It's this litany of devastation. And if you teach that to a class, they either revel in the devastation, meaning this is awful, and they acknowledge it, and they usually know it already. Or they become so overwhelmed by the sedimented reality of that devastation that they can't even begin to imagine what it would mean to change it. And I think, for me at least, grief is a really helpful way of thinking of this, because grieving is not just the experience of me feeling grief for this situation. It's an active process of grieving, of taking agency for relearning my relationships with other creatures, with relearning my relationships to the dead, with relearning my relationship to the past and the future, and thinking, okay, what rituals, what liturgies, what images of the divine might help me navigate that chaos a little bit better, not just for myself, but with others. And it's, I think, something that is very hard to do, because the habits of not just the modern mind, but certain forms of sedimented patriarchy and heterosexism and sexism, androcentrism, anthropocentrism, all the centrisms, intersecting, really often refuse us in some ways when we desire to change. And so this Catherine Keller, that struggle for a new public, that political theology, that desire for a new kind of participating, active commons that we can claim the planet to be, that's human and non-human, that's a new way of thinking of ourselves, and also acknowledging the grief that's present for us.
Mm-hmm. In your work, you talked about, I don't remember how you say his name, Joseph Attig?
Thomas Attig.
Thomas Attig.
Yeah.
So I read some book of his a long time ago.
Yeah.
And in a class on death and dying.
Yeah.
I know that the spine of the book looks like if I had my library with me, which I don't. You know, like when you like look at your books when you have a library and they're all out, and the image of it that has stuck with me forever. And in your lecture, you were talking about how he's describing the way you have to relearn your world and new patterns of living after loss. Yeah. And there's a section one of the images he gives is someone that loses an arm. And that part of grief when you are someone who has had significant physical changes but survived something, right? Like when you lose an arm, and he's talking about a veteran that returns home, right? Like you have the existential wounds of war, but then you also have the physical ones. And like when it goes to something like an arm, it's like losing a loved one because you have phantom pain and phantom movement and stuff. And you have to learn to process and relearn what it means to be you without that. And then you have to relearn how to do all the things you do. And I just remember the description of it. And I haven't read this in years. So like you may be much more familiar with this, but it meant a whole lot to me because I was processing the death of my grandmother, and my mother and mother-in-law all both had been diagnosed with cancer recently when I read this book, and was thinking I may lose one. My mom's was stage 4, so she survived, but I didn't expect it, you know? And this image of, when you've gone through the process, which your body helps you do, even if you don't want to, of learning how to live without a limb. Yeah. Like, you don't look at that person and go, would you rather be living as if you still had pain that it was missing and you could still use it? Right? Because like once you've relearned, then you figure out how to accommodate in the world. It never grows back, but you figure out what it's like to be you there. And you can have deep and rich, meaningful relationships with the people around. But if you ever, but psychologically or spiritually, you don't have the option of a nervous system forcing you to accommodate. Right? And you can still live in this other world. Yeah. And I feel like a lot of the anxiety in people of privilege in facing climate change is realizing that they'll actually have to learn how to live a different way. Yeah. And they're happy to vote to have some of their tax money moved a little differently and maybe move up a bracket or whatever. But if you're actually asking for a change of life, then you should have just taken off their arm, because it is about as hard as losing your partner or a child, right? Like, and he talks in the book about how very few people ultimately like can process those deep traumatic wounds. But we're talking about the wound of losing part of the very source of all your existence. Right? Like, so anyway, that was the image, and you talk about that. So I'm interested if they're, like when you think about the nature of grief and dealing with it, if it actually gives you a type of sympathy most progressive people don't have for climate deniers. And for those who feel like I'm really making progress, we're doing great. And then you're like, really? I mean, yeah, you had 3 servings of vegetables today, but.
Yeah.
Yes, that was a very poorly formed question connected to the affect of remembering a book that impacted me.
It's amazing to me. I mean, well, let me say it like this: like the way that you remember that book, at not necessarily the logical title or even the author, right? You remember the tactile experience. You remember the emotional experience of how that book worked for you. And I think that's what I'm really interested in here is that we need to relearn what it means to be human, or at least recreate a different kind of definition. We need to relearn what a body is for ourselves, and disability studies is really important and pivotal for that. And it does give me a sense of empathy to folks who are engaged in what we call climate denial. Because on one hand, I think that climate denial is, and a few anthropologists have pointed this out, that, the way that people have understood climate is often through measurement of through their own body. Right? This is, how one understands what climate is intimately for a lot of histories, how one understands the local weather. What are the normal patterns of weather in place for this time of year? A farmer will say, and we had a particularly hard winter this year. And that's, so when someone says, how can climate change be a real thing? Because it's freezing and it's snowing outside. Well, I have sympathy for that, because the progression of climate science for a lot of folks has actually been fairly drastic. And very different from the way that a lot of conservationists even have located themselves within the context of observing their ecological context from year to year. And their body memory is different. And that's one thing. The problem with a lot of climate denial is that a lot of the folks who are denying it strongly have positions of power and are using it in the United States in very political ways. And that's dangerous.
Like, you could go through a whole State of the Union and not mention it at all.
Yeah, exactly. And read the IPCC reports and rip them up and think that it's not actually a real thing. But, I actually think that climate denial and climate apathy is, a much bigger and more problematic issue because of what Pope Francis has called practical relativism, right?
Yeah.
That we live in practical denial of the realities of climate change. Those in privileged modern subject conditions, white folks, folks in Europe and North America who use up most energy and have the largest carbon footprints, and that the idea that one could change their lifestyle for a lot of folks is ludicrous. And of course, that's exactly what we need. But we also need that to be not just, you're not going to save the world by taking shorter showers. It's going to take structural change. Mm-hmm. And so the climate denial that matters to me the most is the denial of institutions that refuse to, or structures that refuse to change the patterns of the way they operate. Greenwashing, for instance, that say, my company, see how green our company is, how good our company is for the environment, but they don't actually make any systemic change of thinking through fossil fuel use or impact or travel. I want to, on one hand, pay attention to the way that feeling impacts the individual body of each person and community. And on the other hand, at the same time, hold structures to account for the way that their systemic injustices shape those emotional responses. I think that those two things are not mutually contradictory. And blaming individuals is, like you were saying earlier, it's a constant practice of folks who systems that don't want to change.
Mm-hmm. The language of practical types of denial. Marjorie Suchocki in Fall to Violence, which is the greatest text on the doctrine of sin in the last 200 years, talks about the difference between practical and performative denial. Mm. And what she's getting at is she takes that notion of anxiety in Paul Tillich and says, Paul had a very under-relational ontology. And so what is the source of anxiety is primarily your finitude, right? And so you have this ontic shock. And then so even if it's not acknowledged, spoken, or conscious, there is this presence of your impending death. Mm. And she goes, if you just update your metaphysics, like the death you're fearing is not just your own. Yeah. Right? Like you're in a web of life, like you're interconnected and interstitched with all sorts of living things. Yeah. And the anxiety that you're feeling that can be unacknowledged, but show up in the affect of your existence, just like suppressed memories of experiences, is the death through all the relations you're a part of, right? And so there's a performative denial, but it's not ultimately a real form of denial because it shows up in the fact that you desire someone like Medal of Freedom winner Rush Limbaugh to explain to you how you, as a privileged upper middle class white Protestant in America, is ultimately the victim, and that your straight white male identity is probably the worst one to get in the United States of America today, especially if it comes with, multiple generations of owning poverty and graduate degrees. And, there's so many things like where this anxiety comes up. And then that leads for plenty of people who are looking for allies to go like, they're the problem. And one of the things I love so much, as a minister of thinking in a process relational framework, is that so often the very person that detests you utterly is riddled with the same anxieties that you're trying to wrestle with. And that often the solution is not to ultimately alienate them.
Yeah.
Right. And it's really hard, especially since Twitter was invented, because I get more retweets when I do alienate them.
Yes.
Rhetorically.
Yeah.
And find other people to like and retweet my alienation of them and dismissal of anything about them other than the fact that I've located them in a situation I call the problem. Yeah. So I can dismiss it. And so I wonder how much that unacknowledged, the grief where there's this unacknowledged starting point, that we may even be sharing with people. It doesn't get on the theological radar, right? Unless we rethink what we're talking about when we talk about sin, or we talk about the human predicament, or we talk about creation.
Yeah. Yeah. The notion of the fault of violence is, brilliant text. It's deeply important for me. And in some ways, you mentioned Paul Tillich again. I think the most important theological text for me ever, for a variety of reasons, personal and professional, is Tillich's sermon, "You Are Accepted." And there's this line in the end where he's talking about that there are these moments in which sometimes we experience the grace to say yes to ourselves. There's a kind of moment of authenticity that happens for him in acknowledging our situation and acknowledging that actually our own anxieties or finitude or feelings of alienation or estrangement are actually real, and also at the same time occur within a much larger context than ourselves. That can, of course, on one hand, have the effect of affirming us in our self. Oh, you are accepted. You are who you are. Don't just live out your life. Tweet those tweets. Get that extra moment. But to accept one's context, I think, is to honestly be attentive to what it is, to recognize it is in the context of a larger web of life, and at the same time think about what does it mean for me in an authentic kind of way, or a performatively authentic kind of way for that particular moment, to engage in a larger community that is material, ecological, real and virtual, that is ancestral and in the future as well. And to hold ourselves within that is something that I think is, can be tenuous and anxiety producing, and at the same time, in a poetic way, can be tremendously generative. It's an opportunity to think about, what am I called to create here? How can I engage in reimagination? How can I engage in play, even in this really awful context in which I find myself, where I feel I don't have any moral agency at all.
Right.
But in fact, realize that the resources, they've been called moral, spiritual, renewable resources in these traditions, and in the ways that these traditions have been rethought and reimagined over and over again, that those things hold us in ways that we don't even fully understand.
Mm-hmm. So my last question, and I've done a bunch of events that are for youth ministers, mm-hmm. right? Like where you're talking to hundreds of youth ministers at once. Mm-hmm. And at a number of them, I've done late night, I'll just call it like theology talk sessions, where depending on how it's organized, they may submit questions in advance, or I'll have them like talking groups and then pick the one most people in the group like, mm-hmm. and then vote or whatever. And a couple of years ago, I did like 3 big youth ministry events in a row, basically, like over the course of a month. And I got the same question in all 3 of them. Hmm. It was youth ministers who said, the most pressing question for a lot of our teenagers is, should they ever become parents?
Interesting.
And it was specifically connected to awareness of the environmental crisis. Now, I'm pretty sure I would never put my answer on the internet. And then a couple of months ago, before we moved to Scotland, I'm with my son has a sleepover with his friends, and then I hear them discussing this. And I hear my son say, I just don't know if I should ever become a dad. But unless my dad's faking it, it's clearly his favorite thing he's ever done. And I just would be so sad to not have that experience, but also it just doesn't seem right to bring a kid in the world knowing what they're going to have. Right? So when you start talking about, like, at least Tripp's interpretation of a third of the faces in the room today when you were giving your paper was this concept of like spirituality and ecological grief. They're like, I don't know if this fits in my rubric for theological topics I was handed a long time ago. Like that to me means that this is a question that's actually on the minds.
Yeah.
That leaders of the church in the next 20 years will have grown up asking.
Yeah.
And it's not connected to what's the appropriate population.
Yeah.
It's the apocalyptic question.
Yeah.
Is it moral to have a kid? And I don't even know the exact way of asking this question, but mostly under it, I felt inadequate as a theologian to be asked it, and very inadequate as a parent, because I mostly know that the idea of not being a grandparent for ethical reasons seems horrible. And the amount of creative justification I could come up with to justify the presence of my grandchildren taking place just because I want to enjoy them. Like my grandparents and great grandparents and everyone in my family has ever said they enjoyed being a grandparent that I want. Right. And so that is a new question, right? Like if Sally McFay and Gordon Kaufman at one time occupied the AAR and said, hey, you can't keep talking about religion the same way if we got nukes and they're going to kill the planet. There has to be a whole nother thing that you have to, like, there's like another reason to shake the whole thing and go, our kids aren't sure if they want to have children. Like, can't you update shit now? Like, at what point? Like, all they did was listen to science classes.
Yeah.
Like, at no point did Daddy, who's very aware of what's going on scientifically, say, Elgin, I'd like for you to reconsider offspring.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't know what to think about that, but it freaked me out.
Yeah. I think it's a really profound question. And I think the intergenerational question is, one of the most difficult ones to wrestle with. And you can see the difficulty of it on a political stage when you have folks like Greta Thunberg, and this Friday strikes and kids taking on agency for climate activism when they don't see adults for it. They get it, and they're a little child shall lead them sort of way, and they're much more brilliant than adults on it in many respects, because we're shaped by these old patterns of thinking and old sedimented kinds of power. One, I think that the way that climate ethics gets framed politically is that we must save the planet for our children and our children's children. I actually find that to be one really problematic. I think actually that saving the planet for our children is, on one hand, very anthropocentric, human-centered. It imagines solely a human future. I want to know what it means to save our planet, or think about living on a new planet for the sake of a planetary ecosystem, not just our children and our children's children, though those things may matter for us. I also find it to be politically heterosexist, that there's a certain kind of reproductive family imaginary that people are trying to perpetuate into the future. But that aside, too, I think the real genuine question that a lot of folks are asking about that, and it comes up in pop culture, First Reformed wrestles with this as well, right? That when kids are asking, okay, do I want, or adults are asking, do I want to bring kids into the world? And it's an imaginary kind of question for folks who aren't there yet. I think I would ask something a little bit differently back. And I think I would ask not, should you have kids, or urging them to have kids or not. I think I would ask, what do you want to be generative of in your life? What do you want to generate? What do you want to create? For some people, that will be certain forms of having kids, reproduction, creation of a family. For some folks, it'll be chosen family. For some folks, it will be being generative of carrying on a memory, whether that be a memory of a certain way of living, a skill that an ancestor once taught us that becomes suddenly relevant again in the present, the memory of a species that no longer graces the planet with their sounds or history or body. And for some folks, it will be being generative of new forms of community, whether that be religious, whether that be new forms of connection that happen in institutions or on personal levels. And for some folks, that idea is, what do you want to be generative of? Well, yeah, I want to be generative of a new idea of God, or a new understanding of what it means to enact God on and as this planet. And I think that is, in my mind, having a kid.
Oh yeah.
It's giving birth to something that instigates a new possible future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, but I mean, it is like, to get asked that question is to be asked a question you never asked your kids.
Yeah.
Or like, you never asked your parents, right?
Yeah.
Your kids asked you a question, right? And there's only a few of those I can think of, but that was like, if you're asking a question about a theological topic that maybe wasn't it would have been too taboo for me to ask my parents. Yeah. That's one thing.
Yeah.
Then you ask that one and I'm like, and it's definitely connected to, it's revelatory of what just kind of, I don't know, basic human decencies, affect response to learning about reality. Yeah. And so it makes you question, right? Like when you're like, why would you even say that? It makes you question, like, how many unconscious defense mechanisms do you have going on within you? Yeah. That are just like, no, on the surface, we technically agree about the data, but if it costs me this, I've ignored it. Like that's the part of it that is shocking. And, yeah, I don't know. I mean,
on a pastoral level, it does say a lot about how unknown people are imagining what the future is, right? I think for, for a long time, people have imagined a certain kind of stable thing. Like my grandparents had kids. My parents had me. I'm going to go on and do this.
Yeah.
But the reality is, of course, that sort of narrative is no longer present in the wake of climate change for a lot of folks. And to be honest, in some sense, I'm not sure that that's a bad thing.
Right. And the other part is, I'd just say this, is that once you have kids and you haven't experienced this yet, even if you desire to hang out with your other friends, you don't.
Yeah.
Unless you call us interviewing right now work. And I'm still technically at work, getting text messages saying what I'm supposed to pick up on the way home. And why didn't you tell me you're going to be home by 5:30?
Yeah.
And this is how it works, right? So, like, once you have kids, there is a whole trajectory of what your adulting looks like. That you only hang out with other people who've also had kids. Right. And it shapes your imagination. In the same way, us and all of our friends that did PhDs, and everything you do to have a PhD probably means you've moved at least twice from your family of origin and your home ecosystem and everything that came along with your faith community that gave you faith. And then you're trying to decide, what does my identity to that ecosystem, that religious identity, this family mean after I've moved this many times? Yeah. But I only hang out with other people that incurred debt while doing this whole process. So,
right.
Is this reasonable?
Right.
And then you go like teach people who are in college and not leaving home in a wonderful country that doesn't cause student loans for you to go to a prestigious school. And you're like,
talk about
anxiety. I got screwed.
Yeah.
You're like, this is why you don't pay your professors as much, because they don't have student loans. Like, but I'm just saying, like, there is a sense that so much of the way it's not just like, like Heidegger talked about our thrownness in the world, but then there's the way in which decisions you don't see as world shaping throw you in a different world within it.
Yeah.
Where you experience, existence, where everyone else around you's already internalized the compromises you're not willing to ask.
Yeah.
And, but like, so we have a number of LGBTQ chosen family members who, when I brought this up to them, all are like, "Oh no, Elgin's like is concerned about having children. Like they've chosen not to have children and show up at our family gatherings on a consistent basis." And I'm like, all right, so I'm not completely crazy, right? Like,
yeah. Well, I mean,
I always say it just in the sense of, like, if you think back, about the longer trajectory of human beings, like the fact that there's this, depending on which social scientist you look at, between 100 and 140 people that anybody really holds ultimately dear. Like when your kids or to someone who does not have children, then they show up for things like your married friends don't, right? And your children with friends don't. And are happy being at like our Christmases and Thanksgivings and all this kind of stuff. And like we moved to Scotland and they're like, "Oh, I'm coming to visit." And you're like, "Oh, well." But like your married friends are like, "Let us know when you're in town." So your friend, certain friends that don't have children end up being the closest adult friends to your children.
Right. Yeah.
And it was shocking to me how many of them had the same intuitions as the actual DNA provider for my children.
Yeah.
Where I'm like,
a little bit of anxiety.
Yeah,
for themselves.
I completely get that. And I don't know if this is good.
Yeah, it's complete. I mean, as someone who considers themselves actively choosing not to have kids and thinks of that as a generative kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not choosing that as a lack or an absence in my life. Like, what we choose to create in our lives and how we, create certain kinds of relations, whether they be chosen family, or natural family, really do, matter to us on a visceral level. And those things are all, they're shaped by all those structural isms, of course, on one hand. And on the other hand, they often surprise us in the ways that they disrupt our worldviews at any given day. The kids piece is important, I think, largely because of what's been called nature deficit disorder and the amount of exposure to ecology and to a hopeful ecological future that folks need or want. And that's difficult in this current moment. But I think we do an injustice to kiddos, to various chosen families, if we're not talking about what does it mean to cultivate resilience in our communities and families and selves, because without that resilience and without addressing that question of anxiety that emerges from your kid, the political world becomes a lot more scary and harder to navigate. It's hard to watch certain political unnamed leaders night in, night out deny climate change, enforce and enact certain kinds of cultural violence and actual violence. And it seems to me that with global warming, we're in for the long haul. And that means that it's not that singular fix again. We need to do the long, hard work of trying to make the connections on a planet that we want to live on.
Excellent. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Trip.
And I really liked hanging out with you all day.
Yeah.
So, do you want to tell anyone to go anywhere or to look at anything?
To go anywhere,
like on the internet, or find a book or an article, or like.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Jacob J. Erickson, Erickson. Or I think probably the best place is to find my work at the moment are in the Meaningful Flesh volume edited by Whitney Bauman on religion and ecology for a queer planet, and the Entangled Worlds volume by Catherine Keller and Mary Jane Rubenstein on new materialisms. I've got pieces in both of those that are indicating the bigger project to come.
Awesome. Excellent.